Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session, Embodied Learning in Perspective Transformations, looking at theoretical considerations for empowering underserved students in the time of COVID. My name is Shelbee NguyenVoges. I'm an associate professor of education and the program director of the Master of Arts in Educational Innovations at St. Edward's University. I have over 10 plus years of higher education experience working predominantly with underserved student populations, working across the domain of student engagement, student success, and student development as well. So the talk that I'm going to give today is actually in partnership with a student publication that I have been working on and really excited about. It is an area of scholarship that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and those are some of the things I'm actually going to be talking about. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the absence of embodiment theory in 21st century education, and talk a little bit about how we discuss embodiment learning, why that's important to consider in reimagining a fairly fragmented historical and quantitative approach to adult continuing higher ed, and also talk a little bit about how embodied learning is innovatively meeting the challenges uniquely felt by incoming underserved student populations in the most contemporary 21st century continuing and higher education context, and then offer a little bit in terms of applications and implications. So as I was sort of saying, this is a student collaboration as an extension to a 21st century innovation in theory to practice. And so globally, the demand for higher education continues to increase, with the number of students more than doubling from 2000 to 2014. Learners all over the world are entering for the first time or continuing higher education. However, in the US, not even 50% of those students are completing 2- and 4-year degrees on time. The Complete College America report that came out in 2019 sort of remarked that red flags have long been waving in response to vulnerable student populations and their persistent inequities in higher education. And further, a defining characteristic of most higher education systems are the large disparities in access and completion, especially by income and wealth, as well as by race, ethnicity, and gender. So the UN policy brief, Education During COVID-19 and Beyond, extends that same position in that massive pre-existing gaps in achievement, funding, digital access, along with a fractured educational system, are no doubt exacerbating all of these in the time of COVID. So the UN sort of inserts a new perspective here. And on one side of the coin, the COVID pandemic has created the largest disruption of educational systems in history, impacting nearly 94% of the world's student population, as much as 99% of those in low and middle, lower income countries. But on the flip side, the pandemic has refocused the spotlight to bring precision attention to these very glaring and persistent challenges, stimulating innovation within and across the educational sector in nearly every domain of teaching, learning, and student success. So the result has been a tremendous enthusiasm for the much anticipated transformation and reimagination of teaching, learning, and student success approaches and perspectives across the landscape of continuing K-12 and the higher education domain, particularly as it pertains to underserved student populations. All the way from radio, television, to the Emergency Home Learning Summit, to TikTok, to learning pods, and at-home self-regulated, online, problem-based, collaborative learning. One thing both educational leaders, policymakers, practitioners, K-12 faculty alike can agree on is that the mandate for reimagining educational approaches and perspectives is long overdue. So again, in this talk, I want to bring forth a novel discussion about the absence of embodiment theory as a tool in continuing in higher education context, and the utility of embodiment theory learning and educational transitions for 21st century learners. We then kind of get into a discussion of why embodied learning is important to consider in this reimagination of a very fragmented, historically quantitative approach to understanding adult continuing and higher ed transitions. And further, how embodied learning innovatively meets the challenges uniquely felt by incoming underserved student populations in the most contemporary 21st century continuing and higher ed context. Tentative applications and hypothetical sort of scenarios are sort of included if we have time to bolster those implications and invite a discourse of limitations as suggestions that we might consider going forward. So this first bit about missing literature, right? I sort of discuss this in terms of minding the gap, right? There's a gap in embodiment theory perspectives, especially as it relates to educational transitions. Research concerned with continuing and higher education at the end of the 20th century and the current research in the 21st century is a really sharp contrast in approaches and perspectives to understand first year transition, transfer, and continuing education student transitions. The trend has moved from an external approach whereby focus is placed on academic adjustment and pre-college skill building to shifting the focus to more internal processes. Here, in internally focused processes, attention is placed on how social capital and influences shape attitudes about learning even before knowledge construction has even begun. Embodiment theory and embodied learning has generated new interest across domains, both educative and not in the 21st century, especially as it relates to internal processes and corresponding socially constructed influences. So these are defined as contemporary andragogical theory of learning. Embodied learning underscores how the body can be used as a tool for generating awareness about oneself and the world around them within educative spaces. However, historically, the body is scarcely used as a tool for cognition. More often, embodiment learning is seen and celebrated in education through dance or yoga, theater, kinesiology, math, physics, athletics, all of which potentially employ the body as the aesthetic representation of those respective ideas, concepts. While contemporary approaches to education have long been built on a foundation of cognitive reasoning and assessment, understanding, the body has been systematically excluded from the educative content and learning on transitions, the processes of cognition, let alone the role the body plays in interactions among those students. However, embodiment theory serves as a timely and useful tool which can be used and should be used in an effort to help students explore past and present social constructions of knowledge and how these contribute to meaning made about oneself, the world around them, in continuing and higher education contexts. The 21st century learning context is ripe for utilization of 21st century embodiment theory. Contemporary education is uniquely characterized by more diversity in first-gen students, more adult and minority student enrollment, as well as increased burden on families grappling with this feeling of fit, rising mental health concerns, isolation with increased digital engagement, and challenges in academic preparedness, coupled with limited peer support, peer engagement in the time of COVID. There's a myriad of aforementioned concerns are compounded in an already significant deters and obstacles in persistence and completion for vulnerable and underserved student populations. Limitations in social and cultural capital, as well as navigating academic choices in a more complex and outdated higher ed system, coupled with, again, rising mental health considerations, social isolation, feelings of belonging, they collectively create a daunting back to school experience. So new research, guidelines, information related to student development, psychology, and trauma healing are really being looked at, or we're looking towards that research that illustrates the lasting physical toll that these stressors, past experiences, trauma, and adverse childhood experiences can take on the human form. And that how that socially constructed meaning about the self, capacity, and educational opportunities manifest via the body in a variety of different ways. Some of the formative research in this domain explains that the notion of embodied learning does not merely include the body itself, but includes the senses, the mind, the brain. That is the whole student's personality. The body functions as a natural source of meaning production then, since it helps students express themselves in a natural way. And as such, it is a benefit of students who have sustained trauma previously in their lives to be aware of how these experiences manifest in a physical nature, so that they are better equipped to mitigate these psychological responses to stress in their interactions with others, in the deepening of their own understanding of self and beyond the standard aches and pains or accompanied by sedentary and or stressful student life. So historically, the research spotlights attrition in underserved student populations, long emphasizing these external, tangible, numerical approaches to sense making when it comes to academic adjustment, transitions into continuing and higher ed. Academic adjustment and study skills in that external approach are things like critical thinking, time management, academic mapping, career planning, and those are sort of prioritized over the still important but not as essential social adjustment strategies like engagement to campus, engaging in peer and social support from folks who identify culturally and relationally the same way. And what I mean by that is they share similar lenses of the narrative, especially for underserved minority students who don't have a lot of visibility in terms of modeling. Also in terms of support resources, in terms of how those encourage and emphasize aspects of belonging to the student experience, and helping students identify unique and personal, authentic spaces within the variety of those options that are meaningful and authentic social and cultural capital. In externally focused research on student transitions, there's the utilization of quantitative approaches is most predominant. And these are situated and driven from predictive models to gain insight about who stays and who completes college. Models typically identify a number of factors impacting the student experience, right? Background, high school grades, first generation college student status, even personality, all the way to institutional variables like what type of support resources exist, the type of institution it is itself, the variety of facilities they have in sort of that domain that can speak to those issues. And then all the way to individual, not to round it out, but individual circumstances as well, like debt, family obligations, unique health concerns, all of those are sort of used in these predictive modelings. And point to both internal and external approaches, right? But Burkholder and Holland sort of take a time out for that. They point to both those internal and external approaches, looking at how individual background variables, institutional factors, and situational factors influence student academic and institutional commitment and are critical to academic and social adjustment and ultimately degree completion. Yet the context of learning in the 21st century has seen a return to garnering more information as it pertains to our physical being and how these past experiences are internalized in the body and have a profound impact on a learner's conceptualization of capacity and opportunity in the educational arena, oftentimes before they've ever even entered into the continuing and higher education context. Further, there's increasingly more qualitative curiosity in the consideration of the underserved student and their behind the scenes and their behind the scenes narrative. How are these stories socially constructed long before the higher education experience? How do they shape meaning about the self? How do they shape meaning about the world around them? And how do each of these contribute to limiting belief systems, mindsets, which are formative, lasting, and ultimately most impact attrition from higher ed in continuing education contexts? So that's a little bit about how embodiment theory is largely missing and a way that it could be the answer to sort of remedying this both external and internal approach to sense making about transitions and academic adjustment. And I'll take that a little bit further in sort of mining the gap, right, between reimagining these educational approaches and experiences themselves in the utilization of embodiment theory. So embodiment theory offers us a way to approach the continuing and higher education landscape that departs from these historically siloed, hierarchical, and linear quantitative reasoning reflected in antiquated systems, structures, to one that both practices and applies that needed qualitative perspective to reimagine not just the continuing and higher ed landscape, but also to transform the student experience itself. So recently, new thinking and enthusiasm for qualitative perspectives has aimed to sort of transcend these historical systems and structures and their corresponding approaches, which really have yet to realize any significant change in equitable degree completion across race and class. Continuing in higher education research concerning student transitions traditionally underscore approaches which employ strategic initiatives, curricular, co-curricular, and orientation program in the continuing and higher ed transition, noting positive correlation between participation in such programs and progression to the sophomore year and graduation, irrespective of demographics and socioeconomic advantage. Yet, even in the most recent scholarship, a counter perspective is really indicated, and persistent inequities in college completion for low income first generation students who are consistently outperformed by their wealthier majority counterparts across institutional types. So while we see evidence of positive relationship between participating in these programs and progression and retention, overwhelmingly, we know that the inequities that exist for low income and first generation students are persistent and far exceed the incremental gains that we see that relate to the relationship between participation and overall outcome. Constantly evolving the needs, experiences of diverse 21st century learners necessitates educational researchers, administrators, practitioners, and the full spectrum of stakeholders alike revisit the applicability and the utility of prioritizing and implementing externally focused approaches driven by quantitative perspectives so that these parallel and meet the needs of the whole student. Embodiment theory is both a timely and a useful framework for reimagining these quantitative perspectives in favor of qualitative approaches that align more intentionally with exploration of the self and narrative. Further, in shifting from these externally focused approaches to more internally focused on introspection, we might find not only transformation of the continuing and higher ed landscape, but also transformations in the learning experience and the felt individual perspective transformation of the learner themselves. Historically, the utility of quantitative models has encouraged policy and practice that measures competency-based skills and academic adjustment. These include, but are not limited to, like test taking, study skills, time management, and are benchmarked by how a student has performed historically in K-12 contexts. However, recent research, especially Whitman's 2018 dissertation, it points out that this approach is highly problematic given the considerable number of students who arrive at the higher ed institution as the product of inadequate school systems. Further, quantitative and externally focused approaches that go unchecked and unquestioned result in the students being labeled as remedial, particularly those underserved, traditionally underserved, and are forced to carry the weight of been marked with academic deficiencies before ever even setting foot on the post-secondary campus. Theory and practice related to embodiment and healing, embodiment learning and healing of physical manifestations of our sense making has risen in incredible popularity in the 21st century as the world collectively has been tasked to slow down and truly take accounting of the nuances of self, engaging in a deeper line of questioning beyond the numbers, test scores, and to transform deficiency perspectives. As greater qualitative attention and effort center around understanding the whole student and their corresponding narrative, mental health resilience, a natural extension of research approaches that focus on our bodies, how our bodies bear the brunt of stress. Approaches to understanding how stress and trauma take a physical toll, as well as how to practically respond and to treat this physical toll, are gaining incredible ground and momentum and in representation of the body of research regarding mental health. Driven by a need to flip from these external to internally focused approaches and perspectives, coupled with curiosity about what is actually making the biggest difference in degree completion for these students, contemporary qualitative educational research in continuing and higher ed keeps coming back and pointing to the self, keeps pointing back to the narrative of the underserved student. This research asks what feelings of belonging look like, how that feeling may or may not correlate to mindset, how it may correlate to limiting belief systems, early meaning made about education, and from where this meaning was sourced. Further, and additionally, how each of these questions speak ultimately to the social constructions of education and opportunity from the big picture lens. As the connection between cognitive and physical understanding become more clear, educational systems and curriculum development in the context of continuing and higher ed should account for the role of the physical and embodied learning, and the role that embodied learning plays in informing student knowledge. The implications for transforming a fairly transactional, numerically oriented continuing and higher ed landscape and the experience of the student within that context are vast, limitless. Because the individual nature of stress and coping response is based on the perceptions of the unique learning, the perception of the event coupled with the individual control, self-efficacy, and meaning influences psychological, physiological functions. And since the range of those adverse experiences and unique narratives vary greatly from student to student, so then will subsequent physical manifestations of trauma, and in turn create the impact on the broader continuing and higher ed environment. Further, the utility of implications for employing embodiment theory as a strategy to shift from these less external numerical approaches to more personalized internal approaches changes the very nature of the educational context itself. Consequently, the learners are encouraged to adopt a formative view and understanding how the physical body has informed the learning process itself. While for decades, studies related to learning theories have perpetuated belief that learning is cognitive and restricted within the mind, recent literature has begun to clarify that in fact, learning, problem solving, and memory are not functions of a saving in the brain, but invariably the product of complex, self-regulated sensomotoric function and coordination. So this takes me to my last bit. Not only is embodiment learning missing, not only does it sort of speak to some of the much needed reimagination and transformation of higher ed experience and how that lends to a more formative, empowering student experience, but it also sort of further empowers perspective transformations, and the body serves sort of as the compass to realizing some of those. So that's what I'm going to talk about here in this last segment. And I sort of think about this as empowering perspective transformations via the body. Employing embodied learning theory not only speaks to much needed reimagination and approaches perspectives, but also ideally functions as a timely, relevant, and innovative strategy to empower 21st century learners who are more experiencing stress and isolation from others in increasingly digital educational environments. It's also worth mentioning that in the time of reduced federally supported funds and conversations of affordability and innovative affordability for underserved students, the body as a free, no-cost resource that is always accessible and available. Theories related to embodiment, sometimes also called somatic learning, hold potential to inform many facets of the transition into continuing and higher ed environments in a number of other educational dynamics as well, where learning involves exploring abilities and discerning physical manifestations of emotions or feelings, trauma even, adversity, and how life experiences manifest in the body. Embodiment theory also explains how we learn not from a cognitive place, but from a place of experiential feeling, of doing, and as a somatic understanding. In this way, student success, student engagement, and student development programming, curricular, and co-curricular efforts related to academic and social adjustment would not only be timely and relevant to a socially distanced and contemporary student population, but could also draw on the resources of highest value to embodiment learning theory and qualitative educational research and educational research. The self, right? The self is the resource of highest value. Connecting embodiment theory to the current contemporary dilemmas facing campuses in persistence, mental health resilience could also be a strategy to empower and offer agency to the learner in a way that we haven't been able to sort of do in the past. Embodiment learning theory frames and employs a contemporary educational perspective that inherently integrates and functions as an innovative way to build academic skills, particularly 21st century competencies like communication, critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration. Despite the vast amount of literature that exists regarding long-term psychological ramifications of stress and trauma, there have only been a real recent rise in acceptance of the role of the physical body and the role it plays in the internalization of previous experiences. With the development of somatic and embodied learning theory in 21st century, it's become clearer that the body can assume aspects of traumatic experiences to the point that physical responses can occur in response to a recollected memory. This type of physical response to a trauma event is not uncommon, as modern research has repeatedly illustrated how trauma continues to intrude with visual, auditory, and other somatic reality on the lives of its victims. With this in mind, it could be beneficial to the agency of 21st century learner, particularly underserved student populations and those just transitioning in and out of higher ed, to be aware of how these experiences from the past, which have been a source of trauma or great stress, may in fact still be evident in the physical manifestations they are experiencing, becoming aware of how those happen, when those are triggered, and doing sense making of how the body is an indicator of when that happens. Student development and success in contemporary continuing ed is frequently informed by pedagogy that acknowledges and aims to empower the whole student. But an important aspect of serving the whole, particularly underserved student, would be qualitatively understanding how deficiency perspectives, perceptions of capacity, social constructions of knowledge, belonging, and the relationship to the overarching narrative of the learning are informed by many sources. Therefore, even if a learner appears physically healthy, the psychological and emotional toll of past and or current trauma and stress manifests itself in the physical response. More specifically, physical health is a multidimensional construct that is expressed across a variety of objective and subjective domains. Because of this, it is the benefit of educators in the field at large and the learner themselves to understand how their lived experiences, even if not directly physical in nature, could be informing physical knowledge and subsequently physical health from a place of a cognitive reasoning and understanding. In this regard, focus is placed on internal processes and approaches which invite deep critical thinking, task the learner to engage in clear communication, to thread past, present, and creatively collaborate in safe spaces with other students who may also share a similar narrative. Inherently 21st century academic skills like communication, collaboration, critical thinking are being applied, but are not the focal point of the exercise itself. The learner, their narrative, their sense making via the body, that serves as the vehicle or mode by which academic skills can be built. Further, and additionally, it's advantageous to have a consistent read of one's internal responses. In The Body Keep the Score, the author notes, if you have a comfortable connection with your inner sensations, if you trust them to give you accurate information, you will feel in charge of your body, your feelings, and yourself. Not an undervalued tool and quality in 21st century learning. Recognition of previously experienced trauma and validating the previously lived experiences of learners serves as the prequel to meaningful programmatic offerings aimed at student development and student success. In that, learners are invited to explore perceptions, motivations, past experiences with curiosity and compassion in the employment of embodied and somatic learning theory, ultimately with the goal of a positive educative outcome, but moreover, as a part of making the educational experiences itself one that is formative and empowering for the individual. This implication is particularly relevant to learners entering higher ed and other educational contexts who may not be aware of how experiences in childhood may have had a lasting traumatic impact on their psyche. Often the significance of change on the developing child is overlooked, as children are seen as resilient beings. But in actuality, many experiences and shifts children experience will be remembered and will be recorded in their physical body. For adult learners, trauma experienced in childhood may be tied to losing a relationship, changes in the environment, shifts in self-esteem, a personal perception, or the loss of safety and protection provided from the adult world. But with this in mind, 21st century student populations could benefit from employing theoretical frameworks that borrow from this contemporary research and apply embodied and somatic learning theory in that capacity. Using these theories to educate students not only validates their prior experiences, but also empowers them to mitigate the physical responses they may experience in the recollection of those traumatic events. Adding to the individual awareness of trauma recurring in a physical response can ultimately help manage their prior trauma and incorporate it into their broader understanding of their wholeness as an individual, both cognitively and physically. This is important in ensuring that students' ownership of these varied experiences so that trauma recall does not spontaneously and unconsciously fling the body back into that frozen state of trauma in time, and can be brought up consciously and with mindfulness. With greater awareness and attention in place, students have the knowledge to pursue more specific approaches to treatment for internalized or physical responses to these adverse experiences, stressful times, and traumatic episodes. Greater awareness of mental health and the subsequent manners in which trauma responds to stress and adverse experiences continue to be researched and developed more fully. But it is a great benefit for students, for their personal understanding, their general well-being, to be aware of how these experiences relate to stress, trauma, and how they have a lasting physical impact on the body. Not only is it helpful to develop the practice of listening to the body as a way of gauging lasting, impactful trauma, but it's also in the development of using the body as a compass in a multitude of limitless capacities. Body in that way serves as a barometer or a barometric reading of how one responds to a variety of interactions and stimuli, signaling as a need to pay attention, to hold space for what that potentially means in that moment and beyond that moment. The existing literature has taught and added to awareness and understanding of how the body can be used in these capacities, but the idea of greater segments of our population being able to interpret those physical responses from the body provides a way to step forward more effectively in the management of stress, particularly as it comes to student transitions, and the effective management of our personal experiences as a greater insight into the development of the student as a whole being, both cognitively and physiologically. Student development in the most literal sense will be at least in part facilitated by the understanding and perceptions of lived experiences, of which many may be directly and indirectly manifested in a physical, psychosocial, and emotional way. Regardless, the implications for higher ed settings in how they use the body is capable, and how the body is used and capable of internalizing that knowledge, which may manifest itself physically as a response to the learning experience, may be stressful and traumatic for the individual. But when educators are aware of this phenomenon, they may develop a curriculum that seeks to address and clarify those concepts. And of course, when students are aware of that embodied in somatic learning theory, their understanding of themselves and the life they've lived becomes more tangible, becomes more connected, facilitated to the and a co-facilitator in the development of their holistic selves. To be aware and to be able to mitigate physical manifestations of stress and trauma is to be equipped with valuable knowledge, not in just higher ed, but a valuable lifelong skill far beyond continuing and higher education. I want to thank you so much for sticking with me and hearing all the things that I have to say when it comes to transformations, perspective transformations for underserved students, and thinking about how embodied learning serves as a powerful framework for considering and empowering underserved students in a time of transition and in the time of particularly COVID-19. Thank you so much. My personal email address is snguye12 at stedwards.edu. I'd love to make any contact and get a sense of anyone has any additional insight, or if I ever may be a resource, I am happy to. Thank you so much.